The morning of October 1st, 2025, began like any other summit day in Ouagadougou. Delegates from across Africa filled the grand hall of the African Economic and Security Summit, expecting speeches about trade, cooperation, and progress. But what they heard instead would shake the entire continent and send shockwaves far beyond its borders. When President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso rose to speak, the room fell silent. Cameras flashed. Heads of state leaned forward. No one could have predicted the words that would follow. With calm conviction and eyes steady on the audience, he declared that Africa would begin limiting its cooperation with China. For a moment, silence held the hall like a spell. Then whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Diplomats exchanged uneasy glances. Journalists froze over their keyboards. No African leader in recent memory had spoken so directly, so boldly, about Beijing's influence. Traoré's statement was more than policy. It was a declaration of independence. For decades, China had positioned itself as Africa's great partner. Roads, bridges, ports, and railways had carried the label "Made with Chinese Investment." Billions of dollars flowed across borders in the name of friendship. But hidden behind the smiles and handshakes were debts, dependencies, and quiet fears. And now, for the first time, one young leader dared to call it by its name. His words echoed through the summit hall. "If we are not vigilant today, we will become the new colony of China." It was not a speech of anger, but of warning, not of rejection, but of awakening. Traoré spoke for every farmer whose land was taken for foreign mines, for every student who studied under Chinese-funded scholarships but returned to find no work, for every nation tired of trading sovereignty for loans. That single statement from Ouagadougou would soon travel far beyond Africa. Within hours, global media erupted. Headlines read, "Burkina Faso defies China." Analysts on every continent asked the same question: what pushed Africa to make this turn? As the sun set over the Sahel that evening, a sense of history filled the air. Something had shifted. The age of silent dependency was ending, and the age of African assertion had begun. The speech that shook the world was not shouted in anger. It was delivered in calm conviction. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the gathered leaders of Africa and outlined, step by step, why the continent could no longer depend on China. His message was not only for Burkina Faso. It was for every nation that had once believed that friendship came without a price. He began with a truth few dared to speak aloud. "The Belt and Road Initiative," he said, "is not a bridge to prosperity. It is a chain of debt." Between 2000 and 2020, Beijing had poured more than $150 billion into Africa through infrastructure loans. But those loans, Traoré warned, came with hidden locks. When countries failed to pay, their ports, roads, and energy grids quietly slipped into foreign hands. He cited the haunting example of Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, leased to China for 99 years after its debts could not be paid. That, Traoré said, must never happen to Africa. His second point was even more direct. Africa's riches were flowing out faster than ever before. 70% of Congo's cobalt, 60% of Zambia's copper, and more than half of Angola's oil were bound for Chinese refineries. Beneath the surface of economic growth, he saw a slow bleeding of sovereignty. "We are exporting the veins of our land," he said, "and importing dependence in return." The hall grew silent. Even those who had signed major Chinese contracts knew he was right. Then came the warning that startled military observers around the world. Since 2017, China had stationed troops in Djibouti, at the very edge of Africa's eastern gateway. Officially, they were there for peacekeeping and logistics. But Traoré asked a simple, unsettling question. When foreign soldiers wear the symbol of peace on African soil, who decides when peace ends? He reminded the audience that control often begins quietly, under the banner of cooperation. Finally, Traoré spoke about the new frontier of control. Technology. Huawei and ZTE had wired much of Africa with 4G and 5G networks. Surveillance systems built by Chinese firms were operating in Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Uganda. Cameras on street corners, data stored abroad, and silent monitoring of political activity raised a darker question. Was Africa trading one form of colonialism for another, not of land, but of information? The phrase that followed would echo across the continent. Our freedom cannot survive inside another nation's servers. By the time he finished, the room was heavy with tension. Some ministers looked down, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others nodded slowly, recognizing in his words a truth they had felt for years. When the applause finally came, it was hesitant at first, then growing into something deeper, a release of decades of silent frustration. But the story did not end there. Within days, Traoré flew to Beijing. Cameras flashed as he entered the Great Hall, where China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Premier Li Qiang waited to meet him. The setting was polished, ceremonial, and heavy with expectation. For Beijing, this was a chance to ease the tension, to remind Africa of its gratitude. Officials spoke of friendship, of $200 billion in investments, of shared prosperity. Yet beneath the surface, the air was cold. When Traoré finally spoke, his words were measured but firm. He looked across the marble table and said, "This is not friendship. This is golden trap." Those 7 words fell like thunder. The room froze. Chinese officials shifted in their seats. For decades, African leaders had chosen quiet diplomacy over confrontation. But in that moment, a 36-year-old president from a small West African nation stood taller than the world's second-largest power. Beijing's reaction was swift. Within 72 hours, Chinese state banks delayed loans to Zambia and Ethiopia. Planned investments in Ghana and Mali were cancelled. Trade restrictions followed, a warning to any nation tempted to follow Traoré's path. Yet what China saw as punishment, the Sahel saw as proof. Crowds in Ouagadougou filled the streets chanting his name. In Mali and Niger, officials praised his courage. Across Africa, something had shifted. Fear was giving way to pride. And as night fell over Beijing, one question echoed through every capital from Washington to Nairobi. Had Ibrahim Traoré just triggered the most important realignment in modern African history? What would happen next? Would his defiance isolate Burkina Faso or ignite a continental revolution for independence? The answer was already beginning to unfold. When the echoes of Traoré's speech reached the streets of Ouagadougou, something extraordinary began to happen. Crowds gathered in front of government buildings, waving handmade flags, chanting not against a foreign enemy, but in celebration of a national awakening. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso's people were not responding to a coup, a crisis, or an announcement from abroad. They were answering a call that came from within. Images of Traoré's confrontation in Beijing spread across African media like wildfire. On radio shows from Bamako to Lagos, callers debated what it meant. Was this the beginning of a second liberation, or was it the spark of another storm? Yet one thing was undeniable. The young president had changed the tone of Africa's conversation with the world. In Mali and Niger, government spokesmen praised Traoré's courage, calling it a declaration of Africa's right to choose its destiny. The alliance of Sahel states, already bound by shared security goals, now found itself united under a moral banner. Parliament sessions in Bamako and Niamey turned into symbolic rallies of support. Even leaders who had once hesitated to distance themselves from Beijing began to reconsider their ties. What China intended as punishment for defiance had turned into a badge of honor across the continent. For many Africans, the reaction from Beijing confirmed everything Traoré had warned about. Within days of his statement, China delayed loans to Zambia and Ethiopia and canceled several energy and infrastructure projects. These were not coincidences. They were signals, a reminder of how deeply Beijing's economic web had been woven across the continent. Yet instead of fear, the moves ignited determination. In Ouagadougou, the parliament passed a resolution calling Traoré's speech a second declaration of independence. That phrase carried weight. It echoed through news channels, through sermons in churches and mosques, through classrooms where young students began to ask, "What does independence mean today?" The idea that Africa could chart its own path, without permission from global powers, stirred something deeper than politics. It touched on identity, pride, and the simple dignity of self-determination. Outside Africa, the shockwaves were immediate. In Washington, analysts who had long dismissed Burkina Faso as a minor player suddenly took notice. Former President Donald Trump, still an influential voice, repeated an old phrase that now carried new weight. China is sucking the blood of Africa. Though blunt, his words resonated with a growing sentiment among Americans that Beijing's influence had gone too far. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron seized the moment, telling European ministers that Traoré's challenge to Beijing was a warning to the West as well. If Africa rejects China's control, he said, it is not only about Beijing. It is a call for fairness, for partnership built on respect. The European Union, facing its own dependency on Chinese trade, began to view Traoré's defiance as a mirror reflecting its vulnerabilities. But while Western leaders debated strategy, African citizens were already moving. In markets and villages, discussions about trade and sovereignty replaced conversations about aid and dependency. Activists formed new movements demanding audits of Chinese-backed projects. Students painted murals of Traoré alongside images of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary of the 1980s, who had once declared that Africa would not pay its colonial debts. For them, the young president had revived that spirit, modernized, fearless, and unyielding. In the diaspora, especially across the United States, the symbolism took on another meaning. African Americans who had watched Africa's struggles from afar felt a surge of pride. In Atlanta, churches held services celebrating a new dawn for Africa. In New York, community leaders organized discussions about economic self-reliance, linking Traoré's defiance to the civil rights legacy. "He's doing what our ancestors dreamed of," one speaker said. "He's standing up to the giants." China, meanwhile, faced a dilemma. Retaliation risked confirming Traoré's accusations. Silence, however, would look like defeat. So Beijing shifted its strategy. State media began publishing stories portraying Burkina Faso as misguided, claiming Traoré had fallen under Western influence. But the narrative failed to stick. Too many Africans had already seen what dependence looked like. Too many remembered how easily promises of friendship could turn into chains of debt. As weeks passed, something deeper began to form across the continent. For the first time, nations that had often acted alone were now watching one another, learning from one another, and quietly preparing to act together. The question was no longer whether Africa could resist external control, but whether it could transform resistance into renewal. And as the world's cameras turned toward the Sahel, one question lingered in every capital. Could a single voice from Burkina Faso inspire an entire continent to rise? The weeks that followed Ibrahim Traoré's confrontation with Beijing revealed that his speech had not been a moment of defiance, but the beginning of a transformation. Across West Africa, the political landscape began to shift in ways few had imagined possible. Governments that once balanced between Western aid and Chinese investment were now forced to rethink what independence truly meant. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's parliament convened in an emergency session. Lawmakers rose one by one, some with trembling voices, to declare support for the president's decision. A resolution was passed calling it the Second Independence, echoing the revolutionary era of Thomas Sankara. Across the Sahel, similar declarations emerged. In Bamako, Mali's leaders praised Traoré's courage as a blueprint for African sovereignty. In Niamey, Niger's ministers spoke of a continental awakening. What had begun as one man's statement was rapidly becoming a shared ideology. Economically, the first impacts were immediate and painful. Chinese investors froze several infrastructure projects. Loans to Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia were quietly delayed. For smaller nations dependent on these deals, the fear was real. Could they survive without Chinese credit? Could their fragile economies stand against retaliation? Yet as the initial shock faded, something unexpected happened. A wave of creativity swept across the region. In Burkina Faso, local engineers and entrepreneurs began collaborating with the diaspora. A new telecommunications initiative was launched in partnership with African American and Nigerian tech founders. They called it Main One Africa, a network designed to replace foreign surveillance-heavy systems with secure, African-owned technology. The idea spread like fire. Within months, universities in Accra and Ouagadougou added new programs in network engineering and data security. For the first time, young African graduates were not dreaming of leaving for Europe or America. They were staying, building, inventing, and believing that Africa's future could be built by African hands. The cultural impact was equally profound. In the streets, murals of Ibrahim Traoré appeared beside portraits of Sankara and Kwame Nkrumah. Radio stations aired songs celebrating "The Golden Trap Refused." Talk shows debated the meaning of digital freedom. For ordinary citizens, the president's defiance had given shape to something long felt but rarely spoken, a quiet longing to stand tall, to say no, to be seen as equal. Beyond the Sahel, global reactions multiplied. In Washington, congressional hearings discussed the African realignment. Experts warned that the United States was losing moral ground to a young generation of African leaders demanding respect instead of aid. One analyst said, "If America continues to ignore Africa's voice, China will not be the only one left behind." In Paris, Emmanuel Macron's administration saw an opportunity. The French president told European leaders that Africa's rejection of Chinese dependency could open a new era of partnership, one based not on control but on collaboration. In Berlin and Brussels, diplomats began to quietly study the AES model as a possible counterbalance to Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Even in Moscow, the Kremlin followed developments with careful curiosity. Russia, which had been expanding its military and energy influence in Africa, recognized that Traoré's call for independence applied to all powers, not just China. But the most surprising response came from the African diaspora. In New York, Houston, and Atlanta, community groups of African descent began organizing forums on economic independence. Churches and cultural centers hosted events titled Africa Rising Without Chains. Business networks started discussing how diaspora capital could support homegrown industries without foreign intermediaries. For the first time in modern history, the bridge between Africa and its children abroad was not built on nostalgia, but on shared purpose. The movement that began in a conference hall in Ouagadougou was now reaching across oceans. African leaders once hesitant to confront Beijing began auditing old contracts. Questions were raised in Kenya, Tanzania, and even South Africa. How much debt had truly been paid? How many resources had been quietly lost? The era of silence was over, and as one headline in The Guardian put it, Burkina Faso's stand becomes Africa's mirror. The world was beginning to see a new version of the continent, one that was tired of playing the pawn in great power games. Yet the greatest question still remained. Could Africa truly build a future independent of both East and West? Or would this defiance provoke new storms waiting beyond the horizon? As the echoes of Traoré's defiance spread, the tremors reached far beyond Africa's borders. In Beijing, officials met behind closed doors, searching for the right response. To retreat would signal weakness. To retaliate too harshly would confirm every accusation he had made. State media issued calm statements about temporary misunderstandings, but inside the Chinese leadership, there was a sense that something irreversible had begun. The image of a young African president calling out the world's second-largest power could not be erased. In Washington, policymakers watched with a mixture of surprise and intrigue. For decades, American diplomacy in Africa had relied on either countering China or offering aid. Now a new model was emerging, one that demanded respect instead of charity. Reports to the State Department began using a new term, the Sahel Doctrine, and it referred to Africa's growing desire to define partnerships on its own terms. Congressional hearings soon followed, asking whether the United States should engage Africa as a partner in innovation, not as a beneficiary of assistance. In Europe, the response was quieter, but no less significant. In Brussels, diplomats debated whether Traoré's message could align with the European Union's Global Gateway project, a plan that had long struggled to compete with Beijing's influence. Emmanuel Macron, still advocating for a new relationship with Africa, told his ministers, "This is not just about China. It is about listening to a continent that refuses to be told what to do." In Berlin and Rome, similar discussions began to take shape. Even Moscow reacted with careful calculation. Russia, which had sought deeper influence through security and energy cooperation, recognized that Traoré's warning about dependency applied to all foreign powers. Analysts in the Kremlin quietly acknowledged that Africa's rise could no longer be managed through contracts and bases. It would require genuine partnership. Within the African Union, the ripple turned into a wave. By late 2025, over 50 African nations convened in Addis Ababa to review their economic relationships with Beijing. Some stopped short of cutting ties, but many agreed on one principle: no agreement should come at the cost of sovereignty. It was the first coordinated shift of the African bloc in decades. For the first time, Africa was not reacting to the world's agenda. It was setting it. Yet as new alliances formed and old ones fractured, one question began to surface. Could Africa's newfound independence survive the storms that were certain to follow? As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the city glowed with a light that seemed different. It was not the light of electricity or progress, but of awakening. Ibrahim Traoré's choice had done more than challenge a global power. It had challenged the old belief that Africa must always follow and never lead. Across the continent, that belief was starting to fade, replaced by something new and powerful: confidence. In the villages of Mali, farmers spoke about standing on their own. In Accra, students discussed what a future free from foreign control might look like. In Lagos, traders told one another that if Burkina Faso could act with courage, then their countries could too. What was once a quiet dream was now a visible movement. This was not a revolution of weapons. It was a revolution of will. For decades, others had written Africa's story. They had described its debts, its dependence, and its struggles from faraway offices. But now that story was being rewritten by the people who lived it. The words "second independence" were no longer a slogan. They had become a plan, a belief that dignity cannot be borrowed and sovereignty cannot be purchased. Beyond Africa, opinions were divided. Some called Traoré's decision reckless. Others called it heroic. Yet for millions across the continent, it was something much deeper. It was the sound of silence breaking. The young president had not only spoken for Burkina Faso, he had spoken for every nation that had ever felt small before great powers, and for every generation that had waited to be heard. The world is now watching. Will this movement create a stronger, self-sufficient Africa? Or will the pressure of old powers return to test its resolve? The answer remains uncertain. But one truth has already taken root. The light that was lit in Ouagadougou cannot easily be put out. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Think about what freedom means, not only for nations, but for all people. Because once freedom is found, it has a way of spreading. May God bless Burkina Faso. May God bless the people of Africa, a land of courage, renewal, and destiny.